at a later date. That's great, thank you. So my name is Kate O'Neill, and I'm the Scholarly Licensing Manager at the University of Sheffield. And it's my great pleasure to chair this webinar. The previous webinars in this series have had over 800 people sign up for them in total, and there's about 370 signed up for this one. So it's clear that there's a real appetite to talk about open access monographs and to share knowledge and experiences. So the driver for these webinars is the new UKRI open access policy, which was launched in August 2021. For the first time, it includes a provision for long-form scholarly works, which includes monographs, book chapters, and edited collections, and that's from the 1st of January 2024. So during the consultation period for the policy, there was a number of workshops held with academic community, and these surfaced some key issues and concerns that researchers had, such as the availability of print, the quality and prestige, and also the copyright and third-party management issue, which is what we're going to be talking about today. So a collaboration of university presses in the UK, supported by Jisc, have come together to hold this series of webinars on the subject of the myths around open access for books, as well as to address legitimate concerns and suggest ways to remove barriers to open access publishing. So as I said, this is the third and the final webinar in the series, and the focus for today's is copyright and third-party rights clearance. The session will last between 60 to 90 minutes, and that just depends on the number of questions that we get. So the format is that our three speakers will each give their talk, and after they've all finished, that at that point we'll take questions. If you can use the Q&A box for questions rather than the chat, as it's very easy for questions to get lost in the chat, and I don't want to do anyone a disservice by missing the question out. If we do go for the full 90 minutes and we've not managed to actually answer all the queries, then our presenters have really kindly agreed to follow these up after the event. So today we've got three speakers to talk about their experiences of copyright and using third-party materials in open access monographs, and it's from three very different areas. So Professor Margot Finn from UCL is going to talk about her personal experiences as an academic who published an open access book which contained multiple third-party images. Then we've got Kate Petherbridge, who was the White Rose Libraries manager, who'll talk about third-party rights from the perspective of an open access press manager. And then finally, we've got Chris Morrison from the Bodleian, who is an absolute expert in copyright, and he'll be talking about copyright exceptions and the role that they can play in this space. So with all that said, and a reminder, please use the Q&A box rather than the chat. I'd like to introduce our first speaker. That's Professor Margot Finn, and Margot is Professor of Modern British History at UCL. As an open access author, she's been involved in establishing 2 open access academic book series and has published research on the specific challenges of open access policies for humanities researchers. So with that, I will pass over to Margot.
Thanks very much to the chair, and thanks very much to Jisc for organising this. We're now going to have the obligatory will my screen share moment, which I hope the answer is correct. Now, will it go from the beginning? I am inevitably not able to see slide sharing. Can people live with me keeping it on this, because I'm not able to toggle it to see share slides, or rather slideshow?
If you try from beginning, which is on the left-hand side. Yeah.
Just tried that. Oh, there it is again. Good. So thanks very much for inviting me. Just let me say a couple of words at the outset, just to reiterate what the chair has said. I am someone who has published a book open access in 2018, and I'm a tremendous advocate of that as a way of disseminating one's research. The particular title that I brought out was a co-edited volume with, I think it was 19 chapters by different contributors who ranged from academics, archivists, librarians, through to members of the public who had collaborated with us on a research project on the impact of the East India Company on material culture in Britain. And that particular project, because it was very much designed to work in co-production with the public, was particularly appropriate, it seemed to me, to be affordable and accessible to a wide public. And we've now, again, publication was February 2015, we've now had over 105,000 downloads, either of chapters or of the book as a whole. So I do absolutely believe in the mission of open access as something that can get otherwise very pricey humanities research out there to a wider public. And in my then capacity as the president of the Royal Historical Society, I was the person who presided over the transition of our monograph series, which had previously been published by an excellent non-open access press, into the University of London's open access series, and I've listed on the right one of the titles in that series. That particular series is orientated toward early career researchers, which the RHS defines as within 10 years of the doctorate. And one of the points that I do want to raise toward the end of this presentation is the importance of taking into account the structure of early careerness for academics and some of the difficulties that open access, largely because of precarity as opposed to open access, can pose to the next generation of researchers. So I'm going to start by saying why I think open access is such a good thing for humanities, even though it is an expensive pain. And I guess I am going to emphasize here, I will never again publish an open access book unless I pay someone to do the image rights. I did find this one of the most infuriating and difficult things to do. We had 100 images in the East India Company at Home book, only some of which were owned by the authors. And it's a really difficult landscape to work in. Now, this was 4.5 years ago. I think things are better understood now than they were then, but it remains the case that for humanities and many social science researchers, we don't own the rights to much of the data that we have to publish in the form of images. We're not predominantly publishing charts generated from our own spreadsheets. So copyright holders in the UK and internationally really diverge very wildly in their policies in terms of rights and licensing, very wildly in terms of pricing. The same image can be priced and have a very different policy from 7 different repositories just within the UK. And there's a lot of shopping around and working around these different policies from the perspective of the author. It's also the case that a number of rights holders have no idea what open access is. And because a number of authors also have no idea what open access really is and what rights regimes obtain in it, that really creates a bit of a wild west of a landscape. At least that was my experience. Obtaining approval for OA images is complicated. Now, part of that problem is simply that obtaining approval and licensing for any image, whether it's for an open access publication or not, is time-consuming, complex, variegated, and as I say here, often opaque. But the open accessness of the images does add another layer, particularly in terms of perception for the rights holders. Pricing models that authors and researchers encounter often assume that an OA volume is going to be circulated and downloaded at a very high level. And that makes a real difference in terms of the tariff that the researcher is likely to pay, raising the cost to the author. Now, from my experience at UCL Press, where I've been on the executive for I think 5 years now, I certainly know that there will be many open access titles that are highly unlikely to hit, say, the 4,000 to 5,000 download mark based on the statistics I've seen so far. But on the other hand, the author is in no position to say, look, my book's not going to download that many times. None of us know what that landscape is going to look like. So what I found when I was doing our book was that the default option tended to be, you're going to have to pay whatever the highest download or circulation number is within our tariff. And that really yanks up the price that the author is paying. I think it is also very much the case that authors lack clear guidance documents from their funders, from their presses, and from the rights holders with whom they're negotiating as to what the OA requirements are, and that complicates their negotiations. I'm going to use as an example here one of the repositories that we used for our East India Company book that was the easiest and the best to deal with. So I want to preface what I'm about to say here with the fact that I'm in no way condemning this particular institution. It was one of the best and easiest to work with, and that was the British Museum. And in advance of this meeting today, I emailed them and just noted I was doing this presentation and asked, could I have an image price list and whatever guidance they would give. And I have on another screen that price list. It's admirably clear in a number of respects, but it doesn't mention open access anywhere. And the maximum download print run units that's listed on the standard list is 5,000. Well, as I say, I mean, my book's already way over 5,000. So I think what's happened is that even the rights holders who are most au fait, most willing to grapple with, and in the case of the British Museum, frankly, financially most reasonable to authors. They're not an extortionate provider at all, far from it. And yet, even in that case, it will take several emails and several discussions for an author, particularly a first-time author, to work out what they need to do, how they can do it legitimately. So the system isn't set up easily for authors to negotiate it, and presses vary very substantially in terms of the assistance that they're willing and able to give to authors. The division of labor between funder, publisher, and author is complex and often does not take account of researcher precarity. And that last point is one that I really do want to drive home. I have a former PhD student who published a second book with a very good American university press, which was absolutely the correct press for them to be publishing with. The funder required open access publication. The individual author was at the end of a contract at a university, and the funder categorically would not pay the open access fee directly to the press. It left the precarious academic having to negotiate an honorary affiliation with a university that could then be paid by the funder and could then be invoiced by and pay the press for the open access publishing. So I think there are some serious issues that do have to be discussed when we look at what an early career researcher has in terms of knowledge as to how to do this. And this is where I think the guidance is going to be absolutely essential. But also the funding that is required, which in my experience is higher than the funding that is required for your standard image rights. Just a couple of final points that I would like to, for us to maybe think about a little bit at the end, after all of the technical issues have been discussed and perhaps resolved, I say, ever the optimist. One, and this comes frankly out of the experience of just having completed ref assessments. Every time that the difficulty of images and image rights is brought up in UKRI discussions that I've been in the past, one of the options that's suggested is so-called tombstoning. So if you can't get rights to an image, don't worry, there are ways of presenting it so that it doesn't show up. For much humanities research, if you remove the image, you've removed the data that the historian is interpreting. So tombstoning, as it's called, I think is a fundamentally difficult problem. And it raises the question really of what is open access for? If open access is giving you a document that lacks the data, what does that actually do to the reader's ability to assess its quality in a ref assessment, but more broadly to access the data that's in the argument? Second key point, I think, is that government is very Janus-based in terms of what it will encourage and allow in terms of open access images. On the one hand, there's UKRI, partly supported by Bees, saying open, 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 open. And on the other hand, there's the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, Digital Culture, Media and Sport, which isn't signed up to this agenda at all, and is shrinking grant and aid for many of the rights holders, museums, cultural organizations that they fund, and telling them marketize your images, marketize your images. And again, that's driving up costs from the perspective of the researcher. And bear in mind, some of those researchers are quite early career and quite precarious. And then finally, access to open access as a system, not just the images, is actually expensive. I mean, my university, and I'm proud of them for doing it, has invested a lot of money in setting up an open access press. White Rose and other organizations have invested a lot of money in doing this. Royal Historical Society did it when I was president. Really, really proud of that. But that money often comes out of doing research. And at some point, I think we have to look at cost-benefit analysis for this. Final point, and then I promise I'll shut up. Most of the studies that I've seen that have tried to get at the question of equity, equality, diversity, inclusion, and open access have pointed to issues of inequity. And I think those haven't been addressed systematically nearly as much as they need to be. We live, thankfully, in the UK under the 2010 Equality Act that does mandate that we take that seriously. We don't have an equivalent mandate in terms of open access. So I think at some level there needs to be much more serious attention to what are the ways in which new open access regimes potentially discriminate, of course, across groups that are, for example, groups with protected characteristics. And if they do so, how can we stop that? How can we first identify it and then rectify the anomaly, so to speak? So that's all I'm going to do in terms of speaking. I'm going to stop sharing, and thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you ever so much for that, Margot. That was fascinating. And I think it's really important to not just present open access publishing as sunshine and roses and it's easy. There are difficulties. There are myths for sure, but there are real problems, and thinking about how we actually work together to solve them is really important. So thank you. So our next speaker is Kate Petherbridge, and she's the White Rose Library's Executive Manager. And in that role, she works across the university libraries of Leeds, Sheffield and York on areas of collaboration between the three partners. And her role includes responsibility for White Rose University Press as the press manager, as well as the shared research and e-theses repository. And she also looks at areas into new places that the collaboration can explore. And she, prior to this role, was Reader Services Librarian at the Bodleian Library in Oxford. So Kate's talk is on publishing that includes third-party content, and it's giving observations from the publisher perspective, including some mini case studies to illustrate the reality behind some common assumptions around rights and open access publishing, and shed light on genuine issues. And she'll also discuss the conflagration of issues around digital versus open access publishing. Now, Kate is a little bit under the weather, so we are super grateful that she has managed to still come along. And so I will pass over to Kate now.
Okay, can everybody see that?
Yeah, that's fine, Kate, your slides are shared.
Marvellous. Thank you so much for that introduction, Kate. That seems like a lot to cover in 10 minutes, doesn't it? And thank you too for Margot for that really incredibly interesting perspective, and showing some of the challenges that people working open access are still facing. So just to start off, I want to just say who White Rose University Press is. There'll be people who aren't familiar. We're the press run jointly by Leeds, Sheffield and York. We're fully open access. We publish across a range of academic outputs. We have a library-led management board that sets how we work, and we have an academic-led editorial board that work on what we commission based on peer review. But it's important to stress in kind of response in some ways to some of the points that Margot was raising, that we are here to do publishing a service in terms of the way that we operate as a press. And she's absolutely right in terms of the level of support that academics get varies hugely between different publishers. And we see it as part of what we do to support the academics through all the challenges of publishing, the ones that are open access related and the ones that are just general publishing challenges. And beyond that, we also want to support the open access conversation more widely. So we do local sessions at the institutions, we do one-to-one advice for academics wanting to look at open access, whether with us or not. And we also partner with Jisc on things like the New University Press Toolkit, as well as things like this. So we really are about trying to support open access beyond just the publishing process, if you see what I mean. There are lots of things that are discussed around open access, lots of uncertainty, lots of issues that people come up with that raise that are true, lots of things that are concerns that perhaps are based on misunderstandings. And there are some things that I think are issues, but they're not issues that are OA based, even though OA may be shining a light on some of those issues. And so to start with, I just wanted to take a second to think about Creative Commons licenses and open access licenses and what they do. So the point of an open access license really is to ensure that I mean, it's more complicated than this, obviously, but it ensures the rights stay with the creator of the content. And it sets the default level of permission that that creator is happy with for the use and sharing of their work. It doesn't mean that other things can't happen to it if they agree a separate license within a particular area, but as a default, it shows what people are happy with. And one of the key things to focus on in that is that it's to protect the rights of the creator, and so it doesn't apply to content that isn't created in the preparation of the volume. So third-party content wouldn't be covered by an open access license by virtue of being published in an open access work. And I think one of the things that kind of conflates an issue is that we talk about open access images, and that's not what we're really talking about. What we need to do is to be clear, because it helps rights holders understand that what we're trying to do is to license their work that they own to be published in a volume, and that's the same process really as it should be for any type of publication. The end distribution license of the publication that third-party content will sit in doesn't change in some ways what you're asking for, or the process. As we've heard there from Margot, that there are lots of challenges around that, and that in practice it's not straightforward as that. So just as a couple of illustrations, some of the things we've worked on quite recently. We've most recently published the Hidden Depths volume, and in this there were 73 images, and there was a mix of the author's own, which they were happy to include in the volume under the open access license that the book was published under. They were images that were created and shared under open access licenses already by whoever created those images, and those were then used within the volume in the way that the license that had been given allowed. And then there were images that were licensed specifically for use in the volume, things that were rights reserved, where we approached the rights holders and negotiated the use for that. I think it's worth pointing out, again, as Margot said, it varies greatly, but one of the things we do is we're very much there to support authors in this. And if there's any issues, we will really help in terms of what needs to be asked for and the levels of things, and to help negotiate with rights holders to help the burden on the academic. It's also worth pointing out that for this volume, there is a real mix of specific images and what I've called illustrative images, which seems daft, but it's where it didn't need to be a particular image or something. It just needed to show the concept that the author was trying to illustrate. So examples. This is a screenshot of our e-reader with Penny's book in it, and there you can see a text-based figure that she created for the volume. You can see the caption underneath it that shows her accreditation and the license that she's applied to that. So that's fairly straightforward. And in this one, she wanted an image of chimpanzees grooming. So because she didn't need this chimpanzee grooming this chimpanzee, if you see what I mean, it just needed to be an image of that happening. She found and sourced an image that was licensed for use already. So this wasn't something that needed rights doing, and it was something that she could do through search filtering on the internet and finding resources that she wanted to find. Obviously, this isn't applicable in cases where you need a specific image, and so in cases like this, so for example with our cover image, the rights were negotiated. And it's very interesting what Margot is saying, and it's completely true about the lack of consistency, because this image, when we negotiated it, it was actually easier to negotiate it for an open access book than for a commercial volume. The people who were the rights holders were much keener to see it used in this way than as part of a commercial publication. And in the end, all they were bothered about was the credit line and a copy of the volume when it was published. So there was no payment required at all for this, and it was used for the cover and also within the volume itself. That is not a consistent experience, so obviously. So in terms of that, I don't think there was an image that Penny decided she wanted to use in the end that she could not source and license. and there were not really that many issues in terms of negotiation for this volume. The images that she wanted to source and had to license specifically, there weren't a lot of issues in terms of the way that those rights holders particularly approach the problem. They were open to open access. I think this perhaps illustrates Margot's point about how things have moved on to a degree. But it is still an interesting landscape out there. Another volume that we've published fairly recently was the Capability Brown volume. And I think last time I spoke about this, I said there was more than 100 images, and I counted them this time, there's only 96, which I'm slightly gutted about. But again, there's a mix of the author's own images that were already licensed for reuse, and things we had to license. And in this volume, it was entirely specific images. So the image needed was the image needed. And a lot of them, given the subject matter, were from institutional rights holders from across the UK and beyond. So historical palaces, the British Library, British Museum, the Hermitage, institutions in Germany and the Netherlands as well. And again, the rights for this one were more complicated because the institutions involved were much more varied, and a lot of them were much more traditional in their approach to it. And we did see the issues coming up around licenses being related to print runs, for example, rather than actual use within the volume. But again, when we actually negotiated all the rights holders, we only ended up with one image that in the end we didn't have the rights to use in the format we would want to use it. There's one image in the volume that isn't of the resolution that I would have liked. But that was the only restriction that we found when we'd actually finished negotiating the rights. It was quite a big job, but it was a job that we were very involved in as the publisher, so it didn't necessarily fall down to the academic to resolve all the issues involved. What we did see was a reluctance from some of the chapter authors within this edited collection to even engage with the debate, I think because of the experiences that their peers have had historically with arranging image rights, particularly for digital and open publications. And so there were some chapters where the people who were presenting the work had an assumption they wouldn't get permission and they didn't want to ask, which I think was a shame, because it's just not the experience that we've had recently or in the process of doing these volumes. So am I saying by that it's all straightforward and that it's just a huge misunderstanding? Of course I'm not. As we've heard from Margot, these issues persist. It's our experience as well that it's not a quick process, but I do think that there's a mistaken link between some of these issues and the connection to open access as the source of the problem. Just because open access publishing has revealed an issue or has had people confronting a question doesn't mean that it's actually the cause of the issue that's being looked at. So in looking at it, what are the issues that we've seen in the practice of doing it? And one of them relates to what Margot was saying about academics needing support in this. There is a huge range of academic experience in terms of securing image rights, just in general, but also in terms of understanding of open access as well. And it ranges from people who are really clued up and experienced it and know the questions to ask and are just frustrated by some of the processes that they meet coming the other way, to people who really don't have a lot of experience of doing it at all. And partly that's because of the way that traditional publishing hasn't necessarily pursued this question in the way that perhaps we would expect to do it now. These are genuine things that people have said in conversation when we've been talking about rights and why it's important to secure rights for use in a particular case. And it's not because they're not engaged and they're not doing it, it's because it's never really been explained in a way as to why this is important. But it's just good practice throughout all publishing to make sure you've got the right permissions to use someone else's content. It's not an open access specific issue that we need to do this. And rights holders do make things more difficult. Some are really strong, and some, particularly now, have really started to understand open access. And we see it more and more that there are rights holders who are releasing collections under their own open access licenses so that they can be reused. But when we approach them as a non-profit, publisher open access for scholarly commons purposes, we quite often find that the fees are reduced, the licensing is more generous, which obviously wasn't the case in terms of Margot's experience when she was doing that volume a few years ago. So I think we are seeing progress, but it's not across the board. We are still seeing, particularly in more traditional format license holders, large institutions outside of the HE spectrum, there's definite lack of engagement, particularly digital publication. When we talk about trying to secure rights of publication and you look at what the different options are, digital publication isn't one of them. If you're putting it online, it's a website and that's all that they can think about. There are requirements when you're trying to put content online, make it unusable in a book. So things like making it a thumbnail, things like using a big watermark across it when that would defeat the objective of showing the content in the image itself. In terms of the licenses, they're still focused on the time-bound print run model that they've always been working on, which really isn't appropriate to digital publication, let alone open access publication. And another thing that really doesn't help the academics negotiate this, we're finding that there's still a lack of consistency in the reuse statements that institutions will apply to content. Sometimes you'll look at something and you can say this is downloadable, it's downloadable under a Creative Commons license, and then in the rights statement it specifies all rights reserved, which is a very mixed message. And also in the fees that we see applied, again, as Margot says, it's not something that you can see and kind of estimate across the board. Every interaction still feels different. And there are some things though that really are issues linked directly to open access, and one of the things is about the visibility of open access publications, because they're very accessible to everyone. If content is used without the correct permissions, it becomes a very visible thing, which is one of the reasons why our publishers are so focused on making sure this is right, which is one of the things that makes it feel like an open access issue, when actually it's just trying to do best practice for all involved. There is that need to engage with institutions, with rights holders, to explain open access. But I think the message that sometimes gets lost in that is that how their content will be protected by the statements and attribution we apply, and that's the same in the other publishing models, and as they have on their websites and everything like that. Putting something in an open access book doesn't just distribute it freely without any protection. Author engagement is different in the open access process. We ask authors to engage with this in a way perhaps other publishing models haven't needed to or haven't done. And we do this because we want to make sure that they understand what they're doing and be protected. But part of this needs to be done in a mutual support sort of way. We can't ask authors to engage if we're not going to support them in that engagement. And also, open access is change. It's new, it's challenging, and it's not something that's happening across the board. It's something we're seeing gain momentum here in terms of our own context in HE and in academia in the UK, but we're not necessarily seeing it, for example, that the profit focus move from the way we publish isn't going to drive change with rights holders because of the income stream need. So how does that match up? Again, echoing the point that Margot made. So how do we fix this? This is an incredibly librarian thing to do. I wrote this talk and then I went, and how do we fix this? And obviously I don't have the answers to this, otherwise I would be earning the big bucks somewhere else. But in terms of things that we need to be more aware of, I think academics need support with this. And the experience of people that come to us who've explored open access elsewhere or have done it to date is that perhaps this hasn't been as forthcoming as it needed to be, certainly, and it's something that is really important if we want to make an actual change. People can't do this in isolation. They certainly can't do it from a position of not having people come and help them negotiate the things they need to negotiate from a position of a stronger information background. It's unfair to put this burden just on the academics who are already very busy. So if we're going to support open access publishing, we need to support the mechanisms of it as well. I do think we need sector level engagement with right holders to really show why what they're asking for at the moment aren't suited for digital publication and certainly aren't suitable for open access as we move forward. And I do think that having more clarity about how open access licensing works with the third-party content when we approach license holders, rights holders, and for academics is also going to be really useful in terms of trying to dispel some of the issues that really aren't there when you dig down. But I think it is a deeper thing than just open. I think there needs to be a rethinking about how rights holders want their content to be used in the new digital landscape. It's across the board in the current publishing context, and we're trying to do the right thing in open access particularly, but that doesn't make it an open access only problem. It's something that we need to address across the board, and having wider conversations like this can only help to do that. So that was me. Thank you very much. I will try and stop my screen now. There we go. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much for that, Kate. That was fascinating. And I think especially drawing this issue of going, is it an open access problem or is it digital? And really starting to break that down is important. So our next speaker is Chris Morrison. And Chris is the copyright and licensing specialist at the Bodleian Libraries, University of Oxford, and is responsible for copyright licensing, policy, education and support. He started his career in the music industry and has held copyright-related roles at the British Library and the University of Kent. He's co-author with Dr. James Secker of the book Copyright and E-Learning, A Guide for Practitioners, co-founded the blog copyrightliteracy.org and the associated podcast Copyright Waffle, which I can recommend, and is originator of Copyright the Card Game. So he has a master's with distinction in copyright law from King's College London. So in this talk, Chris is going to provide an institutional copyright specialist perspective on the use of third-party content in monographs and books. And he'll present an overview of copyright exceptions available under UK law and how these are reflected or sometimes not reflected in institutional and publisher policies. And his presentation will discuss some of the common misconceptions about the legal basis for quotation and use of copyright content and provide some useful tips for those looking to review their approach. So hopefully some practical things to take from this. And over to you, Chris. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kate, and thanks, Jisc, for asking me to speak. I am incredibly fortunate to be working at such a fantastic institution and such a great sector. And so I'm now at the Bodleian Libraries, and my role sits in our open scholarship support team. So lots of people at the Bodleian and at Oxford looking at open access, but putting copyright and licensing in the context of open scholarship for me is a really important place for it to be, rather than just thinking about it from a compliance perspective. Not just that kind of makes a job less appealing if you're just looking at it from the compliance perspective, but it also has various knock-on effects. So we're responsible for advising, developing policy on research data management, open access, digital scholarship more broadly, digital preservation, and pilot projects on sort of future directions for publishing and research culture. And we are just recently recruited into a role looking at open access monographs. So there's a lot happening. So I also, as Kate mentioned, run the website copyrightliteracy.org along with Dr. James Secker. This is our definition of copyright literacy, what we're talking about: acquiring and demonstrating the appropriate knowledge, skills and behaviours to enable the ethical creation and use of copyright material. So not just saying we need to know lots and lots of facts about the legislation, but understanding how copyright law works in practice within communities, and really crucially looking at that ethical dimension of it, and really aligning this with information literacy and digital literacy more broadly. So here's a statement: we couldn't possibly fill in the blank because of all the third-party copyright stuff. So I'm sure you could imagine a whole load of things that you could put in that blank space. One of them I would draw attention to is move our teaching online, record all of our teaching events. Yet we had to. So 2 years ago, we had to do it. So many of those existing issues around third-party copyright in the education space, we just had to deal with them because of the pandemic. Just a brief mention, my dissertation did look at copyright exceptions for teaching purposes. So I kind of drilled into that a few years back. So let's go to copyright myth number one. You can't incorporate third-party content in an open access book unless you get permission from the copyright owner to make it available Creative Commons. Well, as Kate Petherbridge already said, that is not the case. The third-party inserts that you put into an open access book are different copyright works from the text of the monograph, which means they can be made available under different terms. They are not just one and the same thing. As long as you're clear on that, you can make that distinction. So the second myth I've got, so permission to include third-party rights will therefore always be expensive because it would need to compensate the copyright holder for all future uses of the work. Well, both Margot and Kate have already touched on this. This is not the case. It may be industry practice to charge more, but as we see, it's uneven and inconsistent across the board because no one quite knows what to do because we're in the process of a transition change. There's nothing in the law that states that that has to be the case for the reason I gave earlier on. So the issue is complicated as we've looked because there are a range of different places we're looking, different sources of authority, and an ever-changing dynamic conversation about how this is working. We've got the legislation itself, Copyright Designs and Patents Act 1988 in the UK. We've got case law that allows us to interpret and understand that, but there isn't very specific case law looking at this particular issue because it's so new and legal action is very expensive and sometimes brings the outcome that the participants don't really want. But we do have funder policy, we have the UKRI policy as well as others. We have publishers with their policies and positions, and then institutions trying to make sense of that. So that's that situation we're in at the moment. So let's look at the third myth in which I bring in fair dealing copyright exceptions. So these are legal use without the rights holder's permission. So some may say they do not apply when content is made available online. I would say that's patently untrue. It was a concern that came up when I was doing my dissertation talking to higher education practitioners, or we can't put things online. Actually, the fair dealing case law that shows what is fair to make available, well, clearly, that's all about making things publicly available. Otherwise, the rights holder would never have taken legal action in the first place. So copyright exceptions available in our legislation. We have research and private study, criticism, review, quotation and news reporting, caricature, parody and pastiche, illustration for instruction. These icons are all from Copyright the Card Game. It is available for download. You might want to print it out and play it with your friends and family over Christmas, who knows? But these are the ones that encapsulate that concept of fair dealing, where it's all about whether a reasonable, honest-minded person would find the use acceptable. Does it undermine the rights holders' legitimate interests? Are they using any more of that work than they need to? So on that basis, here's a myth. Fair dealing for quotation only covers uses of short passages of text. Well, I would say, let's have a look at this kind of impressionistic sense of what I believe perceptions are around quotation norms, that you have clearly acceptable uses. People with, we have since the beginning of scholarship been writing down quotations from what other people say, and no one would argue that you need to get permission for that. There's certainly less risk around low value works. There's certainly more acceptable when it's absolutely integral to the scholarship itself, what you're presenting. Now, entire copyright works, that's where the issues around images become, and poems and other things where in fact they can be reproduced in their entirety within the scholarship. And then there's higher risk around high value works, and then limited context. I'm not really sure, this one that comes up, but how often do people really put things that have no relevance to the scholarship in their books? That's not really how it works. But nonetheless, these are some feeling that I really just wanted to show that this is a continuum, that you don't have this binary, yes, they can, or no, they can't. There's a continuum. But actually, the factors that you do call upon to look at these can get a bit more involved. Now, I draw attention to the monograph, Tanya Aplin and Lionel Bentley's Global Mandatory Fair Use, in which they lay out very clearly arguments in which quotation is not just passages of text and can have a number of different arenas where it could be architectural quotation or use of images. And also pointing towards Claire Painter's dissertation, Fair Dealing, for Criticism and for Review, another master's dissertation from King's College London, in which she really drills into the way in which the publishing industry has looked at quotation and actually sees that from an analysis of what the law allows, the guidance provided by publishers is more restrictive and is actually underutilizing the fair dealing provisions in the law. So there are challenges, but also opportunities, we would hope. But a challenge here, as Margot's alluded to, the DCMS, the funding for cultural heritage institutions, means there's a real tension there between their desire to have open scholarship strategies, open up their collections, and the generating revenue through licensing of the works. And we have this issue around public domain material. Often the digital surrogates are claimed that copyright is asserted in them by the holding institution. And this whole situation creates confusion around copyright within galleries, libraries, archives, and museums, within the organizations themselves and the communities that they serve. So that's really excellently laid out by Andrea Wallace in her report earlier this year, A Culture of Copyright. Orphan works are another issue. Creative works or performances for which one or more of the right holders is either unknown or cannot be found. Here's the Intellectual Property Office's guidance. The Intellectual Property Office, the UK government department responsible for copyright and other IP rights, they have an orphan works licensing scheme. It is not appropriate for open access monograph use because it's restricted to the UK only and has a 7-year limit on the license. Similarly, cultural heritage institutions, education institutions can no longer rely on an exception to copyright for orphan works because it was tied into our membership of the European Union. So there is a reliance on risk management. As I've mentioned before, copyright guidelines, and as Claire pointed out in her dissertation, often very restrictive. Here's just an example of some of them. UK institutions, there's a list of them on copyrightliteracy.org. They tend to want to sit on the fence, understandably so. It's difficult to kind of make a statement where you are potentially opening up accusations of secondary infringement or encouraging others to not pay due attention to the law. And it is often about risk. So that's why the community created codes of best practice, I think, are really important here. So this is an example of one created in the US. So this is the United States, the codes of best practice in fair use for the scholarly research and communication, in which they pick up that under US law and under fair use, analysis, criticism, and commentary of copyright material and quoting it is absolutely supported by the law because under the American tradition, there's a transformative use. Now, it's not that we could just port that unproblematically into UK law, but certainly the principles behind it or the idea behind creating these community-driven codes, I think is really valuable. And finally, we know that there is, and it's been mentioned in the other presentations, an issue around copyright being something that promotes anxiety that people find difficult to work through. Amanda Wackerrook and Celine Garrow-Brennan published last year on their copyright anxiety scale, clearly describing it as a phenomenon. And Jane and I are planning work with Amanda and Celine to launch a copyright anxiety scale study in the new year, which we hope will bring some insights right across the sector. But this is what I was attempting to address in my previous role at the University of Kent in developing a copyright literacy strategy that was about highlighting these tensions, about questioning assumptions, and trying to not simply put everything back onto the researcher academics plate, but think institutionally and structurally about how we address copyright. But I think this is, and this is what we're hearing from the other presentations, something that really does need to happen on a sector-wide level. And on that note, I'm extremely pleased to see the news that UKRI are taking this seriously and have commissioned work, and that Claire, whose dissertation I pointed out, is working with Professors Tanya Aplin and Emily Hudson on looking into this area and coming up with some recommendations, and hopefully that's going to lead to some clarity. So I think we're moving in the right direction, but still a lot to work through. Course credits. Here we go. This presentation where I share the slides is openly licensed, but I don't own the copyright in everything that's in here. Some of it I got under permission, others I didn't, because that is supported by copyright law. And as I said, Copyright the Card Game available for this seasonal period. And that is the end of my presentation.
Thank you ever so much for that, Chris. That was really helpful and enlightening, and a good plug for Copyright the Card Game, as ever. Well done, perpetually marketing. I do love it. So we've got some questions in the chat, and we will start to go through them now with Chris, Margot, and Kate. So if Margot and Kate want to put their cameras back on, please do keep putting questions in the chat as we go through. So the first question does specifically ask you, Margot, but the others may wish to come to this. So could you explain more about the inequity issue? What is it about open access that potentially discriminates against some groups?
So there are a number of studies, and these are not humanities-based, these sort of look at open access more broadly, that suggest inequities in terms of global south versus global north and junior versus senior. This is for junior versus senior, which I'm going to just focus on for the moment. One of the issues there is the one that I referred to before. Building on what Chris said, there's nothing legally that means that open access licensing must be more expensive than rights for a commercial publication. But it does tend to be the case, in my experience, that it will push up the imaging costs. If you're at a junior stage, you simply have less money to put into the kitty. I think if you look at the initiatives across the UK for creating university open access presses, and again, I'm part of that movement, I commend it. I am not in any way speaking against it here. But Leeds, Sheffield, and York have this incredible access to the experts that we've just heard from. Bodily, if you're in Oxford, you have that access to that expertise. If you're at Brookes, Oxford Brookes, you don't have access to that expertise. If you're at Leeds Trinity, you don't have access to that expertise. And in my field, in history, where we've done quite a lot of work looking at where you get racial disparities and other protected characteristics disparities, those scholars in those categories are more likely to be in those less advantaged institutions. So you're baking in inequalities that we already know we have in our discipline, say, or in our university structure, if access to open access isn't equal across the piece. And this is where it seems to me the funder, if the funder doesn't play a key role, we're going to make those inequalities work. And again, I'm not in any way detracting for what our universities are doing in investing in this, but it's costly. And there's a reason that smaller universities, post-92 universities, are often investing less in this. They have less research money to invest. And then the final point I would make, and it really is about early career precarity. You would not believe the lives of people in my discipline who have 3 part-time contracts, all of them teaching-only contracts at 3 different institutions, not one of which wants to pretend that they are doing research for fear that they become ref eligible. And those people who desperately need to publish, and one of the reasons we made the Royal Historical Society series open access for ECRs was precisely because we want exactly these ECRs to have open access publications so they can get the profile, so they can help to get jobs. But it's that those people have the least access to the best expertise. And again, in my field, and this is not anomalous in the humanities, it's that ECR broadly defined cohort that is more racially diverse, more gender diverse, et cetera, et cetera. So that's where I'm coming from on that. I'm not just spouting. There honestly is evidence behind what I'm saying.
Yeah, thank you. Chris, have you got anything to add, or Kate?
I think I'll get Kate to go first. You had your hand up before me.
Oh, I'm just quite pleased I could work out how to do the hand up thing. I mean, I completely agree with what Margot is saying. I mean, what I would say is that Leeds, Sheffield and York didn't set us up to support Leeds, Sheffield and York. So we will answer questions from anybody, as I said in my presentation. So as a university press, we will support, you know, someone from Leeds Trinity emailed me with a question, I would reply to the question just in the same way as I would to everybody else, because that's exactly what we're trying to address, that level of inequity in terms of access to support for it. And as a publisher, one of the things we do is, you know, if people were to invite us to talk to them, we would give the same sort of session for anybody that we would give. You know, we've spoken to colleagues in other universities, both who are thinking of starting presses, but also about open access more broadly as well. So obviously we can't be there in the same way as we are in Leeds, Sheffield and York, but we will do what we can to support everybody. We see this as part of the remit of the press. And on the early career point, again, it's so important. And for that, one of the things that I know we're not alone in this, we have specific projects. We've run prizes in Leeds, and we've just completed the prize in Sheffield for people at that early career stage to be supported through the proposal process to publish their book with us. So again, we are aware of a lot of the things that Margot raised, and I think there's a lot of things that we are already trying to do about it. And part of the issue is the awareness of the things that we can do about it. But in some ways, we're almost our own worst enemies, because we do cling to these ideas that we have these institutional divisions, and just by doing the session today, we're showing that actually no, it's much more about our community trying to drive a direction than us supporting our own institutions. So I'm hoping that will probably come as we grow. I don't know.
From my perspective, I mean, Margot, I agree with everything you said. I mean, there are clearly issues with inequality everywhere we look. In terms of access to expertise, one of the key things that I spoke to the Bodleian about before starting was, is there, it's in the Open Scholarship Support Team. I am able to share what I can with others across the sector, but it's absolutely the case that it's not the same thing as having the advice available to all, equal to all, with the same level of access. And I think that's the work that Jane and I do with copyright literacy and running webinars. It's as much as we can do with the resources that we have. But if we look back where, for example, Jisc Legal, an advice, the service that was available is no longer available. I think we have a gap here. So I think that's why in replying to UKRI at previous consultations, we really do need support for this and for it to be properly funded. But another aspect of inequality, I think, is around copyright risk. So I talk about copyright exceptions, and yes, copyright exceptions are available under law and there is justification for them, but they are defenses to accusations of infringement, and certainly in UK law they're not defined as user rights and aren't clearly they're not defined in the law. The fair dealing isn't defined in the law, and where those boundaries sit is always going to be a bit grey. We want it like that. That's how the law is deliberately designed, in order to be flexible on a case-by-case basis. But what that means is a tenured white male professor is going to have a very different perspective on copyright risk from an early career researcher from a non-traditional background. And that's something that we made explicit in the University of Kent's copyright literacy strategy, that it did have that element to it, and the institutions and the sector more broadly does need to be aware of that. It's not simply a system of kind of mechanized rules that always works in the same way uniformly. It's us in society with human beings in real situations, and I think we need to recognize that. And that's why I try to avoid simply getting drawn into the abstract legal doctrinal arguments, and that's the purpose of looking at it in context.
Great, thank you very much for that. And so there is actually a question which is related. And so in relation to the inequity issue, is this more to do with certain forms of open access such as gold, or is it an issue of how the mainstream academic publishers function more generally? So it's no secret only certain voices and experiences are continually published and perpetuated. Scholars in certain geographical locations have little choice about where to publish, and so can become more at risk of choosing to publish with predatory publishers. So is it a cost issue with open access, or is it more to do with Western knowledge systems and how these are then proliferated via the major publishers? So yeah, it's sort of just going, I think, into a little bit more detail. And I think it's a very interesting thing to go, is gold open access, problematic? And obviously, I mean, I would just say when we talk about gold open access and talk about monograph publishing open access, often there is an assumption that it must require payment. It doesn't. Gold open access is merely that the published version of record is available on the publisher's website. That can be a diamond journal, same way that there are monograph publishers such as Punctum and OBP who are able to publish books at no author cost. So I would just throw that in there, my own little bit, before anyone else answers. So yeah, I think it's going, is it to do with gold open access, or is it about academic publishers in general? If anyone would like to add anything to that. Kate.
I have difficulties, and this is probably not a good thing to admit, I have difficulties with the whole gold, diamond definitions, because we are a gold press because of how we operate in terms of the way we manage our finances, but we don't have author-facing charges, if you see what I mean. We operate a BPC model because there are costs involved in publishing, and those costs, the difference between an author-facing cost, what is an author-facing cost, if you see what I mean. The vast majority of our publications are funded by the three institutions because they do it to support publishing at the institutions and also via us as a press. The rest of them come to us with funding because it's part of the project that involved. And the institutions that operate in different ways, there are still costs involved. They just cover them and they're paid at other points. And the finances come out of the HE system somewhere, if you see what I mean. So I think there was a question from Tom Grady about this in the chat as well, which was also really interesting about the BPC model. And for me, I think that's the wrong question, the gold, green BPC model. I think it's about how we create the funding capacity and then make that available so people can publish where they want to publish and fund the publication costs. I think the issue comes for me more about when the publication costs for monographs for an open model include profit, for example, as we see with others. So it's about the transparency of those. So, and also I think it's about offering mixed models so that people who have funding from different streams can make the most of the funding from different streams as well. So for me, the level of expense and the cost is not to do with the funding model. The way that cost is communicated is the funding model. But it comes out of the institutions at some point, whether that's the funding areas, whether that's institutional departments, whether that's within the library content budget, which is what we're seeing lots of sort of areas of focus flipping to. So for me, it's more about making sure that the costs involved are literally the costs to publish, because I don't want to be paying fees associated with a publication that aren't actually for that publication, because that money should go elsewhere and things like that. So I'm not sure. I think I did a very politician thing of not answering the question that was asked and making a point that I wanted to make, but partly that's because I wandered and I apologise. Hopefully that was relevant.
That's fine. And also, I will say in the chat, Lucy Barnes from Open Book Publishers has made a really good comment that's worth reading. Chris, Margot, did either of you have anything to add to that?
Just 2 points briefly, if I could. I'm really, really glad that Kate brought up the costing issue, that if the cost isn't seen here, it doesn't mean that it isn't paid there. And that's the thing that I think some of open access can be really messianic, and open access advocates can be incredibly messianic. And in that messianic, open access is going to transform the world. And I am pro open access to a large extent. So again, I'm not arguing against that, but the cost, is paid by somebody. And in a number of the humanities disciplines, when you're talking about, with a particular press, it's going to cost between 5 and 12K to publish something gold open access as a monograph. The actual spent invoiced research to produce that book could be less than that. So you could be stopping a colleague from writing a book by paying the BPC on another colleague gold book. And I think we have to be conscious of those costs. And in smaller and less well-funded departments in, for example, the humanities, those BPCs are big sums of money. And if you were to add just one article to that, that could be the amount of QR that, a chunk of staff in that department are getting over a ref cycle. So these sums have got to be totted up and not, put aside. And certainly for the Royal Historical Society and for the University of London Press, we would talk about that. If we spend it to do this and we're going to spend it to do this, then we don't have it to spend on these other things. And sometimes what we don't have to spend it on is, giving people money to go out and do field research. So there's a balance here that we have to bear in mind. The green versus gold, one thing I would say, for longer form publications, during the ref lockdown, I think I looked at a total of 1 green output, because in my field, it's useless to look at the green version on the whole, because the page numbers, you're just going to have to reread it to get the page numbers so you can cite it in a footnote. So there's a real difference between a 5-page STEM article where nobody refers to the page number in most of the things they're citing, and a monograph that's 400 pages long, where it matters to the reader that you can make a precise reference to a version of record. So gold versus green is partly about how a researcher would use these items. It's not just about, do we want to pay the BPC or not? And there, I think we have to be asking questions about, for whom is open access? And one of the people for whom open access has to be is the academic researcher, because those are the people who are going to produce the next bit of research based on the UKRI funded piece of research.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the issue of the comment about basically, is it a sort of, trying to find the exact wording that was said, because I hope I don't get this wrong, but basically the Western ideology of this is how we do it. And I do think there is an important role for institutions such as mine that do have reasonable amounts of money compared to many others, both within this country and globally, to support the kind of open infrastructure that actually allows for a pluralism of how we publish, so that we're not forcing this dominant model in the way that with journal article open access, it was gold, and it will be the APC model. And we see how that's gone. It's expensive. What is it doing? Yes, it means that everyone can read our work, but can other people participate in being able to actually present their knowledge? No. So I do think there's a lot to be said for pluralistic models to support open in its various ways, because there's not one size fits all. Sorry, Chris, were you going to add something?
The only thing I was going to add is I don't think it's covered in any of the gold, green, or any other precious metal, precious jewel terms that we use for open access. The issue here is about who's responsible for resolving third-party rights issues. And that's not talked about in any of those models, because it's all looking at it from the other perspective. But thinking about, this is precisely the issue, Margot, that you faced, and you had to go through that pain. This is not something we should be asking people to do, because for all the reasons we've stated, not in the current climate, not in the way that it works at the moment. So I think I don't. Is there a difference between gold and green? I guess. Not really from that perspective. I think there's some other, I don't know that we need a new term for it, but it's the issue around who is responsible for clearing rights, and ultimately it's something that comes from the publishing industry and from Clark's publishing agreements, the sort of Bible within the publishing industry, that says you will, when you create a publishing agreement, that the author signs up to, they will take on that responsibility, and that needs to be rethought and looked at as part of the overall holistic ecosystem of how this is going to work.
Thank you very much. So this next question, I think is probably going to be you, Chris. So, get ready. Is the current suite of Creative Commons licenses suitable for needs, or should we be exploring if other or additional licensing options could help? That's an interesting question. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I guess there are criticisms of it. I'm not sure if Anna's got any specific criticisms or concerns about particular elements of it. I won't assume which ones they might be. Generally speaking, any system that gets adopted has some drawbacks as well as major positives. I see it a bit like VHS versus Betamax in some ways. Once you get a certain level of adoption, that's the thing that everyone uses. I wouldn't advocate for an entirely different set of tools because we've got so much traction using those ones, and as far as I'm concerned, they're fit for purpose. So I'm not sure that a new set of license tools would resolve this issue, because I guess the way that this particular issue around resistance from rights holders to allow things to appear in open access monographs and books, you'd probably be looking at a more restrictive license or something which in some way addresses the concern around perceived loss of control. And I don't think that's something specific about the technical parts of the license deed of the Creative Commons. I think that's just a general concern and fear about open access per se. So I think that they are suitable for needs, but if there are particular elements of them that you have particular interest in or concern about, I'll do what I can to address those.
Hey, Margot, anything to add to that, or no? No, I assume not. That was a comprehensive answer. Thank you, Chris. The next question is, where the original material is out of copyright, so it's public domain, do authors/publishers still seek rights clearances for faithful reproductions of these when they are produced, provided by third parties? Who would like to make a start on that one?
We would need rights clearance. So if what we're talking about is an image of a painting, for example, where the painting is in the public domain, the image created is not in the public domain because it's been created by a person. So we would need rights to use the image to a degree. That's the way that we would address it, because there is the creative process involved in the creation of the image, if you see what I mean. And that's one of the ways that rights holders do that. That's if you're getting rights to use an image from a museum, that's why we would go down that route. So we would do that. Chrissy's going to tell me I'm wrong, I think.
I'm going to try and phrase my response carefully. I think the legal situation was clarified by the Intellectual Property Office in a copyright notice, I think about 4 years ago. It was confused case law. It's confused by the fact that, as I mentioned in my presentation, many cultural heritage institutions do assert copyright in the digitized versions of their collections. However, the UK government says that if it's an absolute high fidelity facsimile of out of copyright image, then no copyright arises in it because it doesn't show sufficient originality. Part of this is to do with the fact that we were part of the European Union and that we were therefore part of the body of EU law, and EU law developed to say, rather than what was previously the traditional British approach that was about labour, skill and judgment, in which if you use your technical skills to make that the best digital equivalent of the original version, that therefore attracts copyright protection. But since some landmark EU cases, that was changed where it has to be the author's own intellectual creation. So therefore, the creation of that digital version has to show certain free creative choices on behalf of the creator, which is why when it was revised, even though the last kind of major piece of case law we have, which is Bridgman versus Carell, is confused, and there's reasons why we can't really rely on that. But if we look at the law, it seems likely that it does not attract copyright. And if we look at what's happened in the EU now with the Digital Single Market Directive, even though the UK is not putting that in place because we don't have to, and the government says we're absolutely not going to do it, but the rest of the EU is, and it says that certainly for artworks, when they are reproduced digitally, then member states must not allow copyright protection to arise in it. And this is the issue that cultural heritage institutions, including the Bodleian, have got to grapple with. That it's been there for a long time. We are certainly looking at this very, very closely. And I think that's one of the key things, actually, because there's a large amount of material which is put in copyright, and it's actually in, it's not what the law actually says.
And I think that it's an incredibly good point. And I think a lot of the time publisher practice, certainly for us, it's not necessarily linked to, it is to do with the grey areas and the confusion, because what we don't want to do is to put our authors at risk of them being challenged or reputational damage and all the rest of this, because institutions do still profess to own the copyright to these things. So I think this is why certainly if we were going down when we're doing this, it's not necessarily the kind of basis in law that yes, we need to do it because it's this. It's because without it, then that uncertainty leaves you open to challenge.
Exactly. It's exactly the same thing I was saying about fair dealing exceptions. The law may say one thing, but if practice is other, then you go with other, because of how strong it is, convention and caution and wanting to follow everyone else rather than blazing your own trail. But I will find a link to the IPO copyright notice just on that point.
Excellent. Thank you both very much for that one. So the next question is from Tom Grady, who used to work with both Kate and I, and he's now at Copin. So Kate Petherbridge made the excellent point that rights holders' approaches to permissions for digital editions still seem to be rooted in the print world. So it's not an open access issue, like Kate said, it's a digital thing, but open access is surfing it and getting unfairly blamed. So Kate suggested sector-wide engagement is needed, totally agree. But does the panel have any views on how do we do that? How do we actually get sector-wide engagement happening? What are the forums, for example? So maybe Kate, because you were name checked, you might start on that one.
Yeah. I don't know that I do. I think that's it. It almost feels like this is the next big question that we need to answer as a sector. And I think that there's probably lots of different areas and different places that we need to do it. But I'm not sure. I'm not sure that I do have an answer to this. I'd like to be able to make one up, but I don't think I can. I think that there is an equivalence in some ways in the way that institutions have got together in a different way to challenge some of the commercial publishing practices, for example, in the way that we could get together in a much less grumpy and confrontational way to try and have a united front on what the position is and what we're seeing change and what, policy, both funder policy, government policy, institutional policy, and where we want to see the direction of travel with open access going, and what that then has a knock on in terms of the increase in the visibility of digital publication and what that means for right holders who want to engage with the academic debate, because a lot of rights holders do. They want to see research on their collections because it promotes their collections, it increases their understanding of what they hold. Lots of the institutions that hold collections are also institutions that are research institutions in their own right. I mean, thinking of Oxford and their collections in the Ashmolean, for example, and all these other things. There's a whole range of overlap. We're not talking to the enemy here. We're talking to people who we share a lot of common ground with. So finding that way of of going back to what I was saying about being clearer about what some of these things means, being clear about the protections that are in place where there are rights to protect, being clearer on why we're doing this, I think may be a way forward. But I am, you know, as someone who's worked in the Oxford system myself, it is really interesting how different elements of the system don't know what's happening in those different branches. So I think we all perhaps have an assumption that from within our own circles, and seeing the direction of the conversations and seeing the level of understanding grow, that we expect this to be happening in other places, and perhaps that's our own misunderstanding, and that's what we need to tackle first. We need to come up with a plan of how we ourselves come together to then tackle the communications going more external.
Margot?
Yeah, just two things to add to what Kate has said, and I don't disagree with anything at all that she said there. One is that, as I know from both Twitter and any other form of communication I've ever been involved in, getting academics to even pretend to get their head around this it's like taking a horse to water, slamming the water in its face and still not being able to get the damn thing to drink. It is, you know, and I am an academic, but we are as a group incredibly resistant to learning anything about this until we're at the point of publication, when somebody absolutely forces us to get our heads around it. I do think working with scholarly societies in a productive, supportive way can be helpful. And that can also help to even out some of the inequalities, because people from all sorts of institutions belong to them. But ultimately, if the funder has the mandate, the funder should be making themselves responsible for the communication, the guidelines, making sure everyone has equal access among their fundees to the knowledge, because you're the ones putting the mandate on. So whilst I'm sympathetic to people who say academics are so resistant to this, because they're right, we are. But if you just listen to some of the discussion that Chris and Kate were just having, it's partly because I don't have time to learn the legal ambiguities of all of this and whether I should plump for, well, I'm not going to be sued if I do this, but I might be liable, or I'm going to not put those images in because then I'm guaranteed of not being sure. And then that's also all changing because of Brexit. So I think, you know, we have to look at the researcher's perspective and understand that even though, yeah, we're ornery and difficult and resistant to learning this, we're also not well positioned. Particularly in fields where you're not publishing every 3 months. And again, it's different in STEM, partly because of the nature of the data, but partly because of the mode of publication. So I think the funder really has to step up and take some responsibility for making sure that everyone has open access, excellent evidence, excellent guidance to how we navigate this really, really tricky landscape, which I want us to be able to navigate.
Brilliant. Chris?
I agree with Margot. I think that the funder really does need to come in here, and hopefully that the work they're commissioning, the work they're doing, will provide some more clarity. And I also agree with Kate around trying to find ways to come together and talk to. I mean, it's easy when you're talking about copyright to see it in terms of the copyright wars and being on opposing sides and kind of firing shots at each other. But actually, what I'm advocating for in terms of understanding the contours of copyright law, understanding fair dealing, it works for everyone. And I think that's what we get from looking at studies like Claire's, where, you know, there's a parallel. I'm looking at what institutions are doing and what their perceptions are, and then publishers are in the same boat. In fact, if we were to kind of look at fair dealing and find a way of agreeing some of those consensus positions, easier said than done. That's a whole other question about how you go about creating a code with rights holders and users of copyright. But nonetheless, there are opportunities there if we can frame it in the right way. But I think inevitably it's going to be bumpy. It's going to be any change like this when you're moving from one paradigm to another means that there is fear of losing out, and ultimately I believe we will get where we're going. And then there'll be another challenge somewhere else after we've kind of gone through this.
Oh, that's a fantastic last line there, because we've still got an awful lot of questions and we're not going to be able to get through them. And it is a shame, because the next question that we were going to come to I thought was fascinating, around copyright licensing and how that affects the ability to archive and preserve open access monographs. We can't do that in 3 minutes. So, I mean, look at Chris's, go on. You've got
Can I have a quick go? There are copyright exceptions that enable the digital preservation of material since 2014. We've got a whole raft of them in libraries. So if we're talking about pure preservation, copyright shouldn't be a barrier to it, regardless of what the licensed nature of the content is.
Excellent. So we've only got a couple of minutes left. So if there are any sort of like final comments that the panel would like to make, please go ahead. No, that's absolutely fine. So I will finish by saying it has been an absolute pleasure to be able to chair this discussion and to hear from 3 amazing speakers with really valuable contributions in this area. And I think we can see from all the questions that have come in that there's a real appetite to be able to discuss this and talk about the nuance in the areas. A huge thank you to Jisc for putting on this series of webinars, especially Graham Stone and Anna Hughes and Grace in the background, who makes all the technology work, which is a great relief. So with that, so the questions, we will get around to looking at them and sending responses out. The recording will be sent out to people along with a transcript. And thank you very much to Chris, Margot and Kate. And thank you very much to everyone who has signed up to these webinars and come along. Thank you.
Thank you very much.